Get out of my house! You don't belong here anymore!
Her voice was cold, steady, final. The words didn't just land, they shattered me. I was still wearing the black dress from my father's funeral, standing barefoot on the marble steps of our Boston mansion when my sister locked the door behind me. The rain in Boston had just stopped, leaving the streets slick and shining under dim, yellow streetlights. I stood outside the Carter family mansion in a black funeral dress that still clung to the cold of the cemetery. My name is Emily Carter, 28 years old, an investment analyst by profession, and until 3 days ago, I was my father's closest confidant in building Carter Holdings. The mansion loomed behind me like a memory, refusing to fade. White stone walls, tall iron gates, and a porch light that flickered like it was struggling to stay alive. Inside that house was my sister, Samantha Carter, 32 years old. She was striking in a sharp, polished way. Tall, slim, always dressed in luxury brands even at home. Her blonde hair was perfectly straight, never out of place. People described her as confident, but I knew the truth. She was controlling, calculated, and deeply resentful of anything she could not dominate. Our father once said her ambition was sharp enough to cut through family. Yet after my mother's death, she became emotionally distant, learning to hide insecurity behind arrogance. The door opened before I could even knock. Samantha stood there, arms crossed, her expression colder than the wind. "You don't live here anymore," she said flatly. I froze. "What are you talking about?" She stepped forward slightly, holding a sealed legal envelope. "Dad's will, everything is mine now. The house, the company, all 44 million. My chest tightened. "That's impossible. I was with him in every deal, every meeting." She interrupted me with a faint, almost satisfied smile. "And yet here you are, outside." Then she closed the door, not slowly, not hesitantly, just final. I remember standing there for what felt like hours, the marble steps freezing through my shoes, my mind refusing to process what had just happened. I wasn't just grieving my father anymore, I was being erased from my own life. I eventually ended up in a small motel near Route 9. The room smelled like old carpet and rainwater. I sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing my funeral dress, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of everything. That's when my phone buzzed. Unknown email sender. Subject: Carter Holdings, financial anomaly detected. The message was short. "Miss Carter, I worked under your father's finance department. There is something wrong with the company accounts. Hidden transfers, missing audit trails. If you are who I think you are, you need to look deeper." My breath stopped. Because my father, Edward Carter, was a man who trusted no one with numbers except me, and if something was hidden, then Samantha might not be the only one lying. The motel room near Route 9 felt even smaller in daylight. The curtains barely blocked the sun, and the air smelled like old dust, mixed with rain-soaked fabric. I hadn't slept. My mind kept replaying Samantha's voice, sharp and absolute, as if I had been erased from the Carter family without appeal. "I am Emily Carter, 28, once a structured, disciplined investment analyst known for precision in financial modeling. But now I looked nothing like the woman I used to be, hair loosely tied, eyes heavy, posture collapsing under exhaustion. The grief from my father's death had not even settled before reality turned into something colder: suspicion. I opened my laptop again and reread the email about financial anomalies. Something about it felt too specific to be random. If Samantha truly inherited everything, so why did the company records show irregular transfers dated just weeks before my father's death? My father, Edward Carter, was meticulous. He audited even the smallest expense. Nothing ever slipped through him, unless it was intentional. A knock on the door startled me. I opened it cautiously. A man stood outside, early 30s, tall, slightly lean build, wearing a dark navy suit that looked a bit too formal for the cheap motel corridor. His hair was neatly styled, but his tired eyes suggested he hadn't slept well in days. "I'm sorry to intrude," he said calmly. "I'm Daniel Hayes." Daniel had a quiet presence, the kind that didn't demand attention but earned trust slowly. His voice was measured, professional. He had once worked briefly under my father's legal advisory team before moving to independent consultancy after a corporate disagreement he never publicly explained. There was a subtle seriousness about him, like someone who had seen too many hidden truths in financial systems. "I think your father wanted you to see something," he added. "I didn't invite him in immediately. I studied him first." In a world where I had just been betrayed by my own sister, trust was no longer automatic. Finally, I stepped aside. Inside the room, Daniel placed a thin folder on the table. "I wasn't supposed to keep this," he said, "but something about Carter Holdings doesn't match the official narrative." My fingers tightened as I opened it. Bank statements, internal logs, missing signatures. My stomach sank. This wasn't just inheritance confusion. Something inside my father's empire had been altered before he died, and someone had worked very hard to make sure I wouldn't notice. I looked at Daniel. "Why help me?" He paused. "Because your father once told me if anything ever happened to him, I should make sure you weren't left blind." For the first time since the funeral, I felt something shift inside me. Not hope. Direction. The motel room no longer felt like a temporary shelter. It felt like a waiting room for truth. I, Emily Carter, sat at the small wooden table, staring at the documents Daniel had brought the night before. My reflection in the cracked mirror showed a woman I barely recognized anymore. Pale skin, tired hazel eyes, and long dark hair falling loosely over my shoulders. I used to be precise, controlled, the kind of person who could predict financial risks before they appeared. Now I felt like I was chasing shadows. My father's voice kept replaying in my mind. "Don't trust what you see immediately, Emily. Read between what is shown." That sentence now felt less like advice and more like a warning he left behind for exactly this moment. I reopened the folder again and examined a faded legal document Daniel had flagged. At the bottom of one page, and a name stood out. Harrison Cole, a former senior legal advisor for Carter Holdings, retired abruptly 5 years ago. No public explanation. That detail alone made my chest tighten. People didn't just disappear from my father's company without reason. I immediately called Daniel. He arrived within an hour. Daniel Hayes, 32, still carried that calm, analytical presence. Tall, slightly hunched forward as if always thinking 2 steps ahead, with short brown hair and sharp gray-blue eyes that missed almost nothing. Unlike most lawyers I had met through my father, Daniel didn't speak to impress, he spoke to understand. There was a quiet discipline in him, shaped by years of corporate legal battles he rarely talked about. He placed his laptop on the table without greeting small talk. "Emily," he said, "this is worse than you think." On the screen were transaction logs, large sums, routed through offshore accounts, disguised under subsidiary names I had never seen before. My stomach tightened as he scrolled further. "These transfers started 6 months before your father's death," Daniel continued. "But look at the pattern. They spike right after internal board meetings involving Samantha." I froze. Samantha. My sister was not just involved in inheritance confusion, she was orbiting something structured, deliberate, and deeply hidden. Daniel leaned back slightly. "Someone inside Carter Holdings has been moving money out of the system without triggering audits. That doesn't happen by accident." I felt my hands clench. My father built an empire based on control and precision. If money was disappearing, it meant either he knew or someone had been operating under his radar for a long time. And now I finally understood the second name in the file. Harrison Cole wasn't just a lawyer, he was the gatekeeper to something my father never intended to expose publicly, and I was getting closer to it. The office of Harrison Cole was nothing like I expected. It sat on the 18th floor of a forgotten legal building in downtown Boston, far from the polished glass towers of my father's empire. The air inside smelled of old paper and polished wood, heavy with secrets that had never seen daylight. I am Emily Carter, 28, once known for my calm precision in financial analysis, but now standing in front of this office door, I felt like a completely different person, sharper, more alert, as if grief had stripped away everything unnecessary. Daniel stood beside me. He looked unusually tense, his usually composed posture was slightly rigid, and his gray-blue eyes scanned the hallway like he expected someone to interrupt us. At 32, Daniel Hayes had the kind of quiet intelligence that didn't need authority to feel powerful. But today, even he seemed cautious. Harrison Cole opened the door himself. He was in his late 60s, thin and slightly bent forward, with silver hair neatly combed back. His face carried deep lines, not just from age, but from years of legal battles and moral compromises. His voice, however, was steady, almost disturbingly calm. "I was expecting you, Emily," he said. That sentence alone made my stomach tighten. Inside his office, he placed a sealed black folder on the table. "There are 2 versions of your father's will," Harrison said quietly. "One public, one private." My breath caught. He opened the folder, and there it was, my name, Emily Carter. Primary beneficiary, full ownership of Carter Holdings assets, not Samantha, not even close. My hands trembled slightly. This can't be real." "It is," Harrison replied. "Your father updated this shortly before his death. Very specific instructions, very strict conditions." Daniel stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Then why was Samantha acting like she owned everything?" Harrison paused, a long, deliberate pause. "Because she was given temporary administrative control," he said. "Under one condition, she had to demonstrate responsibility toward you. If she failed, everything transfers to Emily." Silence filled the room like a heavy weight. I felt my chest tighten, not from sadness, but realization. Samantha hadn't just taken power, she had been tested, and she had failed. Daniel opened his laptop again without speaking. Within minutes, his expression darkened. "Emily," he said slowly, "Samantha isn't just mismanaging assets." He turned the screen toward me. There were names, offshore accounts, and one repeated entity, a consulting firm linked to illegal financial structuring. Samantha's name appeared indirectly through signed approvals and shadow partnerships. Daniel exhaled. "She's connected to a fraudulent investment partner. This isn't inheritance manipulation anymore. It's corporate fraud." My world tilted slightly. My sister hadn't just taken my place. She had stepped into something dangerous, and now I was standing in the center of it. The moment Harrison Cole finished speaking, the room felt different, heavier, as if the truth itself had weight. I, Emily Carter, stood still, my fingers pressing into the edge of the table to steady myself. I was 28, trained to interpret numbers, not emotional betrayals, yet everything I was learning about my father's empire felt like a complex equation built on hidden variables. Daniel Hayes stood beside me, his jaw tight. At 32, he usually carried a controlled calm, but now his posture had shifted, slightly defensive, like a man who sensed danger closing in. His dark suit looked unchanged, but his eyes constantly flicked toward the window, scanning reflections instead of focusing on the room. Harrison closed the folder slowly. "Your father's intention was never to hand over power blindly," Harrison said. "Samantha's control was conditional. She was required to ensure your safety, stability, and respect as part of the estate agreement." My breath caught. "And if she failed?" I asked quietly. Harrison looked directly at me. "Then she forfeits everything." Silence hit like a physical force. Daniel leaned forward. "You're saying her eviction of Emily wasn't just personal, it was a legal violation?" Harrison nodded once. "She didn't just fail emotionally, she breached the contract." A strange stillness filled my chest. It wasn't relief yet. It was something sharper clarity forming through pain. Samantha hadn't been acting as heir, she had been being tested, and she had failed completely. Outside the building, as we prepared to leave, Daniel paused abruptly. A black SUV was parked across the street. A man inside wore sunglasses despite the cloudy weather. He wasn't trying to hide, he was observing. Daniel's voice dropped. "We've been followed." I turned slightly, but the SUV had already started moving. Back in the car, Daniel gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual. "Someone doesn't want us digging into Carter Holdings, guys," he said. At 32, he wasn't easily shaken, but his tone now carried a rare edge. "I checked my apartment this morning. My files were disturbed. Nothing stolen, just looked at." My stomach tightened. "Samantha?" He shook his head slowly. No, this is bigger. Someone connected to the financial network you're uncovering. I stared out the window, the city blurring past. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just about inheritance anymore. It was about exposure. And someone was watching every step we took toward the truth. The city outside Daniel's car window blurred into streaks of gray and gold as we moved through downtown Boston. I, Emily Carter, sat in the passenger seat with a laptop on my knees, my hands steadier than they had been days ago. Grief still lived inside me, but now it had hardened into focus. At 28, I had always trusted logic over emotion, and for the first time since my father's death, that part of me was returning. Daniel Hayes, 32, drove in silence for most of the ride. His face was sharper now, tension pulling at his jawline. He was usually composed, a man who spoke like every word had been measured in advance. But the weight of what we were uncovering was starting to press through his control. We stopped at a secured data center downtown, a building with mirrored glass and biometric locks. Inside we met Lucas Brennan, a cybersecurity analyst in his mid-30s, slightly overweight, wearing round glasses and a wrinkled shirt as if sleep had become optional for him. Despite his casual appearance, his fingers moved across keyboards with surgical precision. He had a nervous habit of adjusting his glasses every few seconds, especially when processing sensitive data. Daniel handed him a flash drive. "Everything you asked for," Daniel said quietly. Lucas plugged it in. "If what you're looking for exists in the system, I'll find it." Hours passed. Screens filled with logs, messages, and security footage fragments. Then Lucas stopped. "Got it," he muttered. On screen, encrypted messages between internal accounts, deleted call logs, and time-stamped entries showing Samantha's indirect authorization in multiple financial movements. My breath tightened. "This isn't just mismanagement," Lucas said. "This is structured concealment." Daniel leaned closer. "Can you trace origin nodes?" Lucas nodded. "But there's something else. Your father didn't just protect the company. He built traps inside it." Daniel frowned. "Traps?" Lucas pulled up a new file. "It looks like Edward Carter intentionally designed the financial network to expose fraud under pressure scenarios," Lucas explained. "Certain accounts only activate scrutiny when inheritance or leadership shifts." I felt a chill run through me. My father hadn't just built a company. He had built a test, and someone, possibly Samantha, had already triggered it. Daniel looked at me. He knew this could happen. My hands slowly tightened around the edge of the desk. For the first time, I understood the scale of what I was inside. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It was a controlled collapse waiting to be resolved. The gates of the Carter mansion loomed ahead like a judgment I had been avoiding my entire life. I, Emily Carter, sat in the back seat of the official vehicle, my hands folded tightly in my lap. At 28, I no longer looked at this place as home. It had become a courtroom without walls, silent, expensive, and filled with memories that now felt like evidence. Beside me sat attorney Harrison Cole, his sharp gray suit perfectly pressed, his expression unchanged from the first day we met, calm, analytical, almost clinical. He carried himself like a man who had spent decades watching powerful people fall apart in silence. In the front seat, Detective Mark Sullivan, a tall man in his early 40s with a rugged beard and tired eyes, adjusted his radio. He wasn't emotional, but there was a quiet intensity in how he scanned every movement near the mansion gates. Daniel Hayes followed in another car behind us. When we stepped out, the air felt colder than I remembered. Samantha Carter was waiting inside the main hall. She looked different now, no longer the perfectly composed woman I once feared. At 38, she still carried elegance, tall, slim, blonde hair pulled back tightly, but her posture had changed. There was hesitation in her eyes, as if the structure she had relied on was collapsing under her feet. "You brought police?" she said, voice sharp but unstable. Harrison stepped forward. "This is a legal enforcement of contractual violation." Samantha's gaze shifted to me briefly. Something flickered. Anger, regret, or fear. Daniel entered behind us holding a thick folder. "This isn't just about inheritance anymore," Daniel said, his voice steady but firm. "It's about fraud." He placed the folder on the table. Screens were set up by his team, projecting financial trails, offshore transfers, some encrypted correspondence. Detective Sullivan watched silently, then spoke. These records are sufficient for immediate investigation. Samantha's face tightened. You've been digging into private matters you don't understand, she said. Daniel stepped closer. No, we understand exactly what you did. For the first time, her composure cracked. Harrison opened the final document. By violating the condition of care and respect toward Emily Carter, you have legally forfeited control of the estate. Silence filled the mansion hall. I looked at Samantha not as a rival anymore, but as someone who had already lost everything she was trying to protect. And she knew it. The silence after Samantha's final statement wasn't empty. It was final. I, Emily Carter, stood in the center of the mansion hall as everything that once felt untouchable began to shift into something new. At 28, I had expected victory to feel like triumph, but instead it felt like clarity, like finally breathing after years of holding my lungs underwater. Attorney Harrison Cole approached me with a sealed document. His expression, usually rigid and professional, softened slightly as he handed it over. It's done, he said quietly. Across the room, Samantha stood near the staircase, no longer powerful, no longer commanding, just a woman facing the consequences of choices she could no longer rewrite. Her blonde hair was slightly undone now, her posture less precise, as if control had been slowly stripped away rather than taken in one moment. Daniel Hayes, 32, stood beside me. His presence had become steady in a way I hadn't expected when we first met. No longer just a legal ally, but someone who had walked through the collapse with me without stepping away once. The legal transfer was complete. The Carter Estate Company, assets, holdings was now under my control, but I didn't feel the need to destroy what was left of Samantha. I turned to Harrison. She leaves the executive position. No criminal pursuit unless required by law. That's all. Harrison studied me for a moment, then nodded. Understood. Samantha looked at me sharply. You're letting me go? I met her gaze. I'm ending it. That's different. Something in her expression broke, but not completely. It was closer to recognition than defeat. She didn't argue. She simply turned and walked away. Weeks later, the company headquarters looked different, not just in structure, but in atmosphere. Daniel and I stood in the main conference room with a new leadership team. One of them, Claire Morgan, a sharp-eyed operations director in her early 40s with short black hair and a calm, grounded voice, presented the restructuring plan. She had a reputation for saving failing companies, and her presence brought stability where uncertainty had lived. We can recover every division, she said, but only if we prioritize people over legacy systems. Daniel nodded. That's the only plan we're following. For the first time, I saw the company not as an inheritance, but as something living, something that could heal. Outside the glass walls, employees who had feared layoffs were returning to work, slowly rebuilding trust. That evening, Daniel and I stood on the rooftop of the building. The city lights stretched endlessly ahead. You didn't take revenge, he said quietly. I shook my head. As I took responsibility instead. A long pause. Then he smiled slightly. That's rarer. For the first time since everything began, I felt something unfamiliar settle inside me. Not survival, not anger, peace. If you were me, what would you choose? Forgive the person who broke your life, or make them face everything they did, take revenge, or rebuild everything from the ruins? It's easy to say choose peace until you're the one living it, so be honest, what would you do in my place?